Hello, my name is Justin King with Southern Utah University, and today I'll be discussing Thomas D'Angelo's The Case for Full Disclosure. Now, when we speak about releasing financial data out to the public, there's really two avenues that we will explore. The first is our required SEC filings, which must meet all GAAP-approved guidelines. And the second alternative is going to be voluntarily releasing additional information to the market, which does not require that I use GAAP-approved guidelines. So why would we choose as a company to release additional information to the market? There are a couple of key benefits that we can gain from this. The first is that we can pick and choose data that will help us put ourselves in the best possible light for investors. With GAAP-approved guidelines, you must use certain financial criteria, whereas in our voluntary information, we can choose those methods that will put us in the best light, even if they don't meet the standard guidelines. Now, investors are always keen to gain information that's going to give them a leg up on their competition. So by us putting information out into the market at the most opportune times, we can gain investor commitment to come and put their resources into our company that we may not otherwise be able to match using the required SEC filing dates. So with that being said, what are some issues with doing voluntary disclosure of financial data? Well, as we mentioned, we get to pick and choose the data that we're putting into the report. We don't have to follow GAAP guidelines. This means that companies will often exclude information that might make them look weak compared to competitors, and they will only include information they think paints a positive picture. Investors will see this information and may not realize that they're not getting a fair apples to apples comparison with other companies who are only using the SEC filings, and they will therefore make an investment choice that is more risky than they otherwise would have. In response to this problem, the SEC created Regulation G. Regulation G is meant to help stem some of this issue and try to provide proper context with information while not excluding the availability of voluntary disclosures for companies. What Regulation G requires is that if I show you a non-GAAP guideline, such as adjusted earnings per share, I must also show you the nearest GAAP-approved guidelines, such as GAAP earnings per share. And I have to be able to show you how I got one from the other. It also requires that when I release my voluntary disclosure, within 48 hours, I must release my full GAAP-approved disclosure as well. But even with this requirement, many companies still choose to exclude information from their voluntary disclosures by leaving off entire pieces of their financial documents. When we look at Fortune 500 companies from 2009 through 2016, 38% of them chose to voluntarily withhold financial data from the investment market because they were afraid that it would paint them in a negative light. So as a company, knowing that I must release my GAAP-approved guidelines anyways, why should I worry about including it with my voluntary disclosures? Well, the reason is that we may sway some investors to come over by picking and choosing financial data that doesn't meet standard GAAP guidelines. We may bolster our perceived image in the market to draw additional investors in who otherwise wouldn't look at us. But because we are required to release that GAAP-approved information, once the market has seen that we skewed the numbers in our favor, it's likely that there will be a market correction and our valuation will drop back to what it otherwise would have been. Along with that, we're likely to encounter some bad press because people will assume that we did so in order to sway investors into a company that was more risky than what they were willing to take on. Now, we've just said that we are required to produce this additional information, so we're not causing ourselves any additional work. We're not adding any time into the process when we choose to include the full GAAP relations into our voluntary disclosures. Now, what about the issue with investors? Regulation G was invented to help protect investors, and we can still follow the letter of the law by including our GAAP release within the required 48 hours of voluntary release. Well, that is true, but we should also be looking at what the spirit of the law is, which is to protect those investors. We're not gaining any additional benefits from waiting because the market will correct itself, but we may be taking on additional risk with the bad press that comes along with trying to hide or otherwise alter our financial standing. So it is going to be more beneficial for us in the long run to just release everything all together. That is our final recommendation to the firm, is that we don't want to be known as a company that is trying to hide our current financial situation, but we also don't want to go so far that we lose the ability to put ourselves in the proper context against our competitors. It's true that GAAP protects investors because it allows them to do apples to apples comparisons between companies, but it is still restrictive, and there are often times that looking at alternative valuation methods are going to be more accurate in determining what the true value of our company is. Therefore, we need to use that flexibility that the voluntary release gives us in allowing us to tell our story, but we should also be fully upfront about what our standard financial situation is so that investors are able to gain confidence that we are fully disclosing information that is relevant to them when they become shareholders.